It's the evening of March 12th, 1928. You're standing on a dirt road in San Francisquito Canyon, about 40 miles northwest of Los Angeles. The air is cool. The scrub-covered hills on either side of you are already in shadow, and the last light is draining from the sky above the ridgeline. Behind you, rising from the canyon floor like a concrete curtain, is the St. Francis Dam. It stands over 185 feet tall. The reservoir behind it holds roughly 12.4 billion gallons of water, enough to supply the city of Los Angeles for weeks. The surface of the reservoir is calm, almost black in the fading light. You wouldn't know, standing here, that the dam has been leaking. You wouldn't know that earlier today a man drove up to inspect one of those leaks and declared the water running clear, no sediment, nothing to worry about. That man was William Mulholland, the most powerful engineer in California. In a few hours, this dam will cease to exist. To understand the St. Francis Dam, you have to understand Mulholland. He was born in Belfast in 1855, emigrated to the United States as a young man, and arrived in Los Angeles when it was still a dusty, half-formed town of fewer than 12,000 people. He found work as a ditch tender for the city's private water company, a laborer digging and maintaining irrigation channels. But Mulholland was something unusual, entirely self-taught, relentlessly curious, and possessed of an almost supernatural confidence. He read engineering textbooks at night. He studied geology and hydraulics on his own. By 1886, he had risen to superintendent of the water system. He would hold that authority in various forms for the next 4 decades. His great achievement was the Los Angeles Aqueduct, a 233-mile channel that carried water from the Owens Valley on the far side of the Sierra Nevada down into the city. It was completed in 1913, an engineering marvel, and it transformed Los Angeles from a dry, modest settlement into one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. Mulholland became a civic hero. But the aqueduct created enemies. Farmers in the Owens Valley watched their water vanish southward and grew furious. Through the 1920s, they fought back, sometimes in court, sometimes with dynamite. On multiple occasions, sections of the aqueduct were bombed. These were the California Water Wars, and they were bitter, protracted, and personal. It was partly in response to these attacks that Mulholland decided Los Angeles needed more water storage, reservoirs that could keep the city supplied if the aqueduct were sabotaged again. The St. Francis Dam, begun in 1924 and completed in 1926, was one of the largest of these. It was a curved concrete gravity dam built into the walls of San Francisquito Canyon. Mulholland designed it himself. He had no formal degree, but decades of experience had given him, and those around him, an unshakable trust in his judgment. There was no independent review of the dam's design. No outside engineers were consulted. In a modern regulatory framework, this would be unthinkable. In 1920s Los Angeles, it was simply how Mulholland worked. Problems appeared almost immediately. As the reservoir filled, new cracks opened in the dam. Water seeped through and around the structure. The canyon's geology was treacherous. One abutment rested on an ancient landslide, the other on a type of sedimentary rock that weakened dramatically when saturated with water. Mulholland was aware of some of these leaks. He did not consider them alarming. On the morning of March 12th, 1928, the dam keeper Tony Harnisch-Fieger discovered a new leak on the dam's west side. He telephoned the Department of Water and Power. Mulholland himself drove up to inspect it that afternoon, accompanied by his assistant Harvey Van Norman. The two men examined the muddy water seeping from the base of the dam. Mulholland judged the water to be clear enough, no dissolved material, no sign of structural failure. He declared the dam safe and drove back to Los Angeles. It was one of the last consequential decisions he would ever make. Tony Harnischfeger returned to his small cottage at the base of the dam with his young son and his partner. What happened in the final hours is reconstructed from physical evidence and the testimony of survivors. The reservoir was nearly full, just 3 inches below capacity. At some point after dark, the western abutment began to give way. The ancient landslide material, saturated and unstable, could no longer hold. At approximately 11:57 p.m., the dam failed. It did not crack or overflow. It came apart. Enormous sections of concrete, some weighing thousands of tons, were ripped from the canyon walls and hurled downstream by the force of the water behind them. The collapse was nearly instantaneous. A wall of water surged down the San Francisquito Canyon. It was estimated at 140 feet high in the first moments after the collapse. Taller than the dam itself, carrying shattered concrete, mud, trees, and everything it touched. The dam keeper's cottage was obliterated. Tony Harnischfeger, his partner, and his young son were among the first to die. Their bodies were never found. The flood moved fast, roughly 18 miles per hour through the canyon, and as it reached the wider Santa Clara River Valley, it spread out across the landscape. But it did not slow quickly enough. Farm towns, labor camps, and small communities lay directly in its path. Most of the people living there were asleep. In the town of Castaic Junction, a construction camp housing Edison Company workers was swept away. In Fillmore and Santa Paula, the flood crashed through neighborhoods and orchards. Houses were torn from their foundations and carried for miles. Telephone and power lines went down immediately, so there was almost no warning system. People woke to the sound of roaring water in the dark. Some warnings did get through. In the small community of Piru, a telephone operator in Piru received a frantic call about the flood and began ringing every household she could reach, urging people to flee to higher ground. Her calls saved lives. How many is impossible to say. She continued calling even as the water approached her own switchboard. Motorcycle officer Thornton Edwards of the California Highway Patrol rode ahead of the floodwaters through the Santa Clara Valley, pounding on doors and shouting warnings. Families who heard him climbed to rooftops or ran for the hills in their nightclothes. Some survived by minutes. Others didn't hear him at all. By the time the flood reached the Pacific Ocean near Ventura, over 5 hours after the dam's collapse, it had traveled roughly 54 miles. It left behind a swath of destruction up to 2 miles wide. The Santa Clara River Valley was buried under a thick layer of mud and debris. At first light, rescue workers and local residents encountered a landscape almost unrecognizable. Entire orchards were gone. Roads had vanished. Houses lay in shattered piles miles from where they had stood the night before. Bodies were found, tangled in wreckage, buried in mud, or lodged in the branches of trees. The official death toll was eventually placed at around 431 people, though some historians believe it may have been higher, possibly over 600. Many of the dead were migrant farm workers and their families, living in labor camps along the river. Their names were often unrecorded, their absence unnoticed by official counts. It remains one of the deadliest disasters in California history. When investigators reached the dam site, they found only fragments. The center section was gone entirely. Two massive wing sections lay downstream like toppled monuments, half buried in silt. The scale of the destruction was almost incomprehensible. The dam had not merely failed, it had been erased. Photographs taken in the days after the collapse show enormous slabs of concrete scattered across the canyon floor, some standing upright like gravestones. The reservoir was empty. Where billions of gallons of water had been, there was only a muddy basin and the exposed bones of the canyon. A coroner's inquest was convened almost immediately. William Mulholland, now 72 years old, was called to testify. He did not deflect blame. He did not hide behind subordinates or committees. When asked who was responsible, he did not flinch. If there was an error in human judgment, he said, I was the human. The panel ultimately found the dam's failure was due to defective foundations, the unstable geology that Mulholland had either missed or underestimated. No criminal charges were ever filed. Mulholland resigned from public service within the year. The man who had built the system that made modern Los Angeles possible spent his remaining years in quiet obscurity, suffering from what those close to him described as deep, unrelenting grief. He died in 1935. He never built anything again. The city of Los Angeles paid out millions in damage claims, an enormous sum for the era. But the process was slow and uneven. Wealthier landowners received compensation relatively quickly. The migrant workers, the laborers, the families living in tents and wooden shacks along the riverbed were largely forgotten. Bodies continued to be found for months. Some were recovered as far away as the ocean. Remains continued to surface for decades. A victim was found near Newhall in 1992, over 60 years after the flood. Many were never identified. The true scope of the loss, particularly among communities that left few written records, may never be fully known. The St. Francis Dam failure transformed how dams are built in the United States. In its wake, California established the first independent Dam Safety Review Board. The principle that no dam should be designed, approved, and built by a single authority, no matter how experienced, became foundational to American civil engineering. Today, the ruins of the St. Francis Dam still stand in San Francisquito Canyon. They are not a park. There is no visitor center. A few concrete fragments rise from the hillside, weathered and cracked, slowly being reclaimed by the landscape. Most people who drive past them do not know what they are. In 2017, a memorial was finally dedicated to the victims of the disaster, 89 years after the flood. It stands near the dam site, a small and quiet acknowledgement of what was lost. The names listed there are incomplete. They always will be. The story of the St. Francis Dam is, in the end, a story about the limits of individual certainty. Mulholland was not careless. He was not corrupt. He was a brilliant man who trusted his own judgment absolutely. And in this one catastrophic instance, his judgment was wrong. The water he had spent his life controlling became the instrument of his ruin and of the deaths of hundreds of people who never knew his name.